I'm Tobias Revel.
And I'm Radha Mystery.
And this is Futur-ish, a podcast about how nothing is new and everything has happened before.
We've been working and playing in futures for over a decade of hype and bluster amidst increasing uncertainty and complexity.
In each episode, we explore a recent event or signal for its historical context and speculate on future possibilities.
And make it make sense for people like you and me.
Sorry, I've literally got home 5 minutes ago. I know everyone's asleep and jet lagged, so I'm having to eat my toast dinner. And I didn't have any lunch.
I am exactly where you are. I got home, I got home yesterday and then went straight into parent duty because my husband was solo parenting for 5 days, even though I was only in Dubai for 48 hours, which is wild.
Yeah,
that's how long it freaking takes. Yeah, that is how long it takes. I was like probably on the plane or traveling almost as long as I was physically in Dubai. So
it was the same for us going out for Australia. It was like 29 hours travel where we arrived 35 hours later or whatever it was.
Yeah, I got that part.
And then I gained the time coming back, yeah.
In the linear construct of time. Yeah, thank you.
I can see you're in a good mood today. This is going to be a fun podcast.
I am so sleep deprived. Okay, so
anyway,
I'm just looking at our notes.
Don't look at the notes.
Don't look at the notes. But I see a fun update, a Tenbury Wells update. Oh my gosh, can we start with that? I'm sorry. I got excited.
That's okay. I can adapt. You know, I'm resilient like that.
Tobias adapting. Wow.
I can adapt. We just talked about holding space and self-awareness and all that stuff. It's very clear.
All right, sir.
Emotionally and psychologically mature individual. When it suits me. Well, I was gonna start with two things. First of all, an update on our friends in Tenbury Wells, who you may or may not be aware, but last week the UK was hit by Storm Claudia, which caused a lot of havoc over the part of the world that Tenbury Wells sits in. Mercifully, Tenbury Wells was unaffected by Storm Claudia. A lot of other communities were pretty devastated and disrupted. It was some of the most severe flooding in the UK for years. And I thought to check in with Tenbury Wells. And luckily, there were a couple of articles actually covering the local area and saying, look, if this had hit Tenbury Wells, it would have been the end. Like it would have been... That would have been it. Would have been the wipeout. So good news for Tenbury Wells there. I mean, not good news in the long term, but they've survived another round. Second thing is that we've been getting lots of really wonderful feedback from people listening to this boondoggle, which has been very rewarding, a little intimidating in some cases, but very rewarding.
Yeah.
And even some of that feedback, certainly I've taken on board in the editing. So there's been a couple of comments about pacing and speed and cutting and things like that. So that's always been really useful. Coincidentally, Spotify reached out directly. I think the CEO himself emailed to point out that at the ratio we're getting subscribers and listeners and for the amount they're listening, we should encourage people to subscribe to the podcast.
Like and subscribe and share and review. And we're so bad at this because for the longest time, I thought we maybe had 1 or 2 listeners. But apparently, so this is the thing about being in Dubai, actually, at the Future Forum this week, was like so many people came up to me. Not so many, I'll say a handful. Let me not get ahead of myself. But a handful of folks came up to me, some of whom I didn't even know, and mentioned our podcast, Tobias. One of our friends has also said to me multiple times now that we need to get better at promoting ourselves, which you and I are famously horrible at.
Do please like and subscribe if you're listening. And if you don't like, that's fine. You can just pretend and like anyway.
You can just lie. It's okay.
Subscribe might be a bit harsh because you probably don't want it in your feed if you genuinely loathe what you're listening to. Anyway, right. Have you heard, Radha, of the phrase too cheap to meter?
No. Can I take a guess?
Yeah, of course.
Of what it means. Is it from like a taxi, like a fee? A transit fee? You can't meter it because it's too cheap?
I mean, that's sort of the concept, but it actually comes from energy originally. So this was coined by Lewis Strauss, who at the time was the head of the US Atomic Energy Commission, in a speech he made in 1954 to the National Association of Science Writers, where given the expectations of nuclear energy, he said, "It is not too much to expect that our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter." So in other words, energy would be so abundant that it wouldn't be worth metering it. And of course, that never really happened. Nuclear power turns out to be incredibly expensive, largely because of the infrastructure and the security around it. So an interesting thing that jumped out to me this week, and I actually learned about this in Australia, but I also saw it in the news, is that friend of the pod, Australian government, will be introducing free electricity 3 hours a day for Australians. Now, this is often covered in the news as for all Australians, but it's a bit more limited than that. So it's for South Australia, parts of Queensland and New South Wales. For 3 hours a day, around midday, will be entitled to free electricity, free energy, completely free, subsidised by the fact that over the last few years, Australians have installed 4.2 million solar panel systems on homes, resulting in a crisis of overabundance. So during midday peak times, when energy use is often lowest and production is often highest, there's more energy supply than there is demand. And so this proposal, because it will go into action in July 2026, is really interesting because it identifies two emerging problems with renewables, and particularly with solar power. One is this crisis of overabundance, that actually we are entering a point with solar power, which has been speculated on by some, that it does become too cheap to meter, that actually energy becomes so abundant that you can't be costing it. And even in the case of Australia, it might be negative. And the other thing it does is deal with some of the inequalities that are nascent in renewable energy systems. So let me walk you through this story a little bit. So one of the major problems that has happened over the last few years in grids across the world is that increasing electrification has increased demand and also made grids less predictable and more unstable. And I talked to some of our colleagues, in fact, about this problem when we were preparing a recent report, and we're sort of interested to discover that the reason for a problem we're seeing across the world, which is that the wholesale price of electricity is dropping, but the retail cost is going up, it's to do with the fact that there's so much more demand on the grid than there used to be, right? So people charging electric vehicles, much more electric devices, but also they make the grid much more unstable. So whereas before, the amount of electric consumer devices someone might have in their home are very predictable and quite modelable. You know, when do they turn the kettle on? When do they put the washing machine on? It's now a lot more noisy and chaotic, which means the sort of headroom needed on the grid is higher, even when the demand might not actually get there at any point. And part of this is what's been called the duck curve challenge. And it's called the duck curve challenge because I'll flash it up on the screen, but it's a graph that shows that during midday and all over the world, solar production is highest, but demand is lowest. And then during early evening, demand is highest, but production has started to sort of filter off. And actually that chart ends up looking a bit like a duck, basically. So it tries to solve that problem by not only making electricity free during midday so that people can then use this overabundant resource, but also to try and shift people's usage. So people who would otherwise do their washing, charge their electric vehicle whenever they get home from work and it's peak demand, they might be encouraged to do it during the free period so that it tries to balance out demand across that duck curve. So it's not only about making the most of the supply, it's also about shifting demand into the midday period, which when you think about it is pretty radical because it is arguably the first time in hundreds of years in which we've had to change our behavioral patterns to match the sun and the moon. Like the promise of fossil fuel energy was you have abundant energy all the time. Lights can be on all the time. You can cook whenever you want. You know, you can do whatever you want whenever you want. The paradox of solar power is we do have abundant energy genuinely for the first time, but it relies on you falling back into sync a little bit with what the sun is doing.
Can I ask a question? This kind of also assumes, like, if we think about people's workday schedules, are they getting a break in the workday to take advantage of this time? Or like, how does that start to factor in to a scheme like this? So
on the surface of it, this policy is very progressive, 3 hours of free power a day. So that depends on you, yes, either being someone who's at home because you're a stay-at-home person, or you can work from home, or you have devices that you use timing for, or you have a battery. And so part of this is encouraging a shift in consumer behavior where people will buy white goods that have timer functions on. So you leave for work in the morning at 8 a.m., but you set your dishwasher to go off during these times because those are obviously going to rebalance the grid as well. Or The real thing is you invest in batteries, because the real value in solar energy, it's about being able to store that overabundant energy to then deploy it later, which is really the game changer for renewables.
But even with the battery stuff, like as I understand it, the upfront investment is quite hefty, right? So again, you're talking about a particular socioeconomic group who's able to afford access to something like this.
Absolutely, yeah. Batteries are the big cost. So I just had my solar power system installed, and it was about £13,000, right? I think that's $1 million. I can't remember how exactly the exchange rate works. But yeah, I think £8,000 of that is the battery. And then the solar panels themselves were probably about 1,500, and then the rest is all just paying for the guys to come and drill holes all over a Victorian house and figure out how to set it up. So the solar panels themselves are relatively affordable and relatively cheap, but the batteries are where both the technological opportunity is, the economic opportunity, but also quite interestingly, the political opportunity, because it introduces a new dynamic to how we think about the politics of energy when everybody's got their own battery. But yeah, just to go back to Australia quickly, part of this is trying to incentivize behavioral change. Although they're offering free energy during these peak times, so for 3 hours around midday, they'll also be increasing the cost of peak time. So it's going to go from 43 to 47 cents a kilowatt for peak energy usage, again, to encourage people.
Yeah.
That's the stick to the carrot of the free time on the other side.
I knew there was something.
It should result, though, in average household savings of about 800 Australian dollars, which is about $500, about 400 and something British pounds. But people who are trying to sell back to the grid during this time will also have their tariff reduced to like pittance. So if you have excess solar energy during that time that you're trying to sell to the grid, it won't be worth it, which means you basically have two options. One is you try and use it yourself. So again, shifting that behavioral pattern to run your high load things during that free period, which is really what the proposal of this is for. Or secondarily, you are forced to buy a battery because you're like, look, the only way I'm going to make the most of this deal is by having a battery and storing that energy to sell back later once it's worth more, not at this peak time. For Australia, this is also partly a political project.
Mm-hmm.
Australia is very similar to the US, has a big kind of cultural tension around fossil fuels, in that part of its economy is based on fossil fuels. And there's a lot of criticism from parts of the political spectrum that say that renewables increase the cost of energy, that are resulting in declining living standards, et cetera, even though Australia has pretty good standards of living. And so this is partly also just a really thumb in the face to prove that that's not true. That actually renewables make everything cheaper. And I think the chief energy minister went out saying this is about showing that what's good for the planet is good for the pocket. So those two things go hand in hand. And this is, I think, the important thing to remember. For people who cannot afford their own solar systems, those are often the people most hard done by fluctuations in energy prices. I'm okay, I can buy my energy security, but there are plenty of people who can't.
Yeah.
This is giving them directly 3 hours of free energy a day. And that is not to be underestimated, right? That's huge. That's a huge get for a lot of people. And that's really, really important. The other side of that is taking the people who can afford it and saying, look, we need to get you a bit into line here to make this work across the country. Are you familiar broadly with how, like, at a national level, certainly in Australia and the UK, or I assume it's a similar system in the US, do you have a good sense of how energy arbitrage works, like how the energy market works?
No, I do not.
So you have the market operator, who in Australia is called the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, and they represent all the different state market operators. And basically every 5 minutes, they put out a call to suppliers. So those could be fossil fuel suppliers, they could be renewable suppliers, to say, well, this is how much energy we're going to need in 5 minutes time. What's your cost for that energy?
5
and they
minutes?
Send in a bid every 5 minutes. Yeah, every 5 minutes. This
That
happens.
is wild. That's insane.
This is one of the reasons for the cost increases, is those periods used to be really easy to model because people's consumption had it relatively stable.
Yeah.
And electrification has just meant that it's crazy. It's like really unpredictable minute to minute.
That sounds so volatile as an industry.
It is. And in some places like the UK, the energy suppliers have a real stranglehold, so they can really kind of squeeze the markets for what they want. But that's basically what happens every 5 minutes. And what this system will mean is those 4.2 million homes are joined into what's called a virtual power plant, where you are basically, with everyone else who has a solar system and a battery, you are one power plant that can generate a certain amount of energy collectively and store a certain amount of energy collectively. And that can arbitrate with the grid to say we can buy and sell energy as a virtual power plant collective.
Every time you say solar system, I think planets, but it's your personal solar system, not...
Yeah, I probably shouldn't say that, should I? I'd never thought about that.
Are you like the king of the universe now?
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to the woman who owns the sun in a second.
Oh, there's a woman who owns the sun? All right.
Yeah.
What loophole did she find?
Well, I'll tell you about that in a second. It's a loophole that we've come across before in this podcast. So this is a massive thing for Australians. It obviously upset some of those major suppliers a little bit because there was a drop in their value straight away on the announcement of this of about 3%. So some of the major providers went out and said, we wish we'd been consulted about this. It's a great idea, grumble, grumble. But basically, seeing that they were having a share of their market eaten into by this opportunity to give out free energy. What I really want to focus on is this is a signal of a problem that we're going to see more and more, which is this problem of overabundance. And solar has had so many interesting technological effects because it has directly reversed, and I mean even mechanically directly reverse a lot of the presumptions people have had about how energy is going to work. And you can see that in everything from projections that have imagined it will only ever be a niche thing to the reality that it's, massively cheapening, very accessible for an energy system, that it works pretty seamlessly pretty much every time.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of those assumptions are being really challenged. But the overabundance problem is a really big one because when there is more supply than there is demand, the other providers are disincentivized from bidding for that time. They're basically making negative money. They would be paying to supply because there's no demand at all. And so they do things like shut down generators because there's no incentive for them to keep running if they can't make a profit off them at that point. And at this time periods that these grids work, every 5 minutes counts. So if you're saying, look, for the next 3 hours, there's more supply than there is demand, you might just go, well, we'll just shut down the generator. And then 3 hours later, you're like, well, now I need to start up the generator again, but there's now more demand than there is supply. And so there's now an energy deficit and we run the risk of, spiking energy prices and or brownouts.
This seems like a mess.
It is a massive mess. So I think there's an interesting signal there about how different governments and different organizations and states and companies are going to deal with this problem of overabundance. And the second thing is this idea of the politicization of grids. And this was illuminated to me once when I was visiting a university where they were doing research into autonomous vehicles. And the professor who was showing me around sort of offhandedly says, I'm not really interested in autonomous vehicles, except when you think about them as batteries with wheels. And I was like, that's really wild. So he was sort of saying their interest in it wasn't so much moving people, but moving energy. So how could you charge up an electric vehicle and say, actually, we need energy over in this part of the city and then have it autonomously move over there and deliver 15, 20 kilowatts of power to another part of the city. But then that quickly spiraled in my mind because if we have loads of people who own autonomous vehicles and are putting vehicles all over the place with batteries in, we have people with batteries on their back walls and they're collecting solar power. Your energy market, although represented by this virtual power plant, is suddenly moving from a dozen actors of different suppliers to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of actors who are all on the energy grid. What if, for political reasons, I, as the owner of that battery, decided to withhold the power from the grid at a time when it's exactly needed? What if I organized with another group of people who also felt the same with me, that we would enforce blackouts until our demands were met by withholding energy from our batteries? If we're going to have these grids that are supplied by these increasingly distributed systems, then we have to acknowledge that those systems are also all vulnerable to the whims of the people who own them.
I'm just curious to think of what else does it make space for? What does it hold space for? This signal towards new considerations for policy and how we conceive of our energy grid and the production of energy and the abundance of energy.
There's three, and I haven't got to the third thing here, but there's three genuinely very new and challenging things happening here. The first is the promise of industrial capitalism was that we'd untether ourselves from the needs of the planet. We are creatures of abundance. We can travel wherever we want. We can make whatever we want. We can leave lights on all day. The street lights that went up on Millbank on the north bank of the River Thames in the World's Fair were the sign of the future to come. You'd be able to walk around safely at night. You'd be able to go out all the time. Football matches were held after work because you could light up stadiums, et cetera, et cetera. That was the promise of the energy economy. What the solar economy is saying to us is that for the sake of the grid, at least for the foreseeable future, it's asking us to change our habits to align back with the sun. Say, actually, we are not untethered from the earth anymore. We are tethered deeply to it, and we can make the most of that by actually aligning our habits back with it. And I think that's a really interesting social shift to ask for people, because we built our lives around a work-life balance that isn't aligned to the sun, that is sort of ambivalent to it. And that, I think, introduces really interesting effects we might see roll out in different ways. So would we start to see employers who are adjusting their demands for working patterns for the same reason? Because employers also run businesses that would benefit from these 3 hours of free energy. So might they be making promotions, for example, during that period to encourage more customers in? If they're in retail, might they be encouraging people to take all their video conferencing calls during that period? If you're running a lab or a software company, might you be doing harder processing during that period? So that introduces a bunch of really interesting social changes of the type we probably haven't seen since COVID. And the second bit is the overabundance problem, which again is this idea that an entire grid and an economic system has been built around the idea of scarcity and energy. And now that's having to be undone because supply is not tightly constrained because it's the fucking sun and it'll shine all it wants, right? And you can't turn it off. So it's it's introducing a lot of counterintuitive logic. And then the third one is this new politics. So this idea that actually decentralization, as we would expect, introduces a new politics because it allows consumers a lot more control and importantly become actors on this at least local, if not national, grid system. And so, as you identified early on, this does privilege people who do have batteries or electric vehicles with batteries in or solar systems. And so what I have also been very interested in is where people have been trying to help others onto the renewables grid and the connection they make with this as a form of political empowerment. So 2 projects in the UK. One is the Lynmouth Road Power Station in Walthamstow, northeast London, which is basically a street where a couple who are artists who live on that street decided that they could find new methods through selling some of their art, which I won't go into the process of that, but also crowdsourcing to get everybody on the street solar panels and then connect them into one giant plant that they collectively own. So that's been going on for a little while and they've been doing lots of exciting fundraising processes. But there's an interview with one of the residents, Pippa Evans. She says, it's building on a sense of community that started to grow during the pandemic. To me, it's almost as important as the energy. It's within human nature to be self-centered, and I think the political climate has encouraged that. But humans are sociable and we're interdependent, and those aspects can be emphasized when we're working together and helping create something. As a community, we can make bigger changes than as individual people. So this idea that abundance isn't more, it's just having more empowerment over the stuff you need to live. And that is very much the narrative running through the Lynmouth Road Power Station that is also reflective of some of the other ones in the UK, like the Brixton Energy Project and Repowering London, which are also community-centred operations. And again, you read these stories and everyone's just reflecting on that being about community empowerment and bringing community together. And we've talked before about my problems with community as an abstract, but when there is an issue such as the energy grid is unreliable, energy prices are going up, we don't like the politics of it, we don't like fossil fuels, we want to control our access to energy, people will build a community around it. And that does become a galvanizing force.
It kind of like, to me, reminds me of like the village model, right? People coming together, sharing resources. And I wonder if there's almost kind of like a looking inward again, and if it starts to dictate how people move through or like what decisions they make about where they move as well, right? Because essentially you're sharing energy with your neighbors, and who are your neighbors, and like, are those the people you want to kind of be around? And so it's not necessarily just about access to, I don't know, in the States, or at least in California, we're thinking about like access to schools and how far away our office is and things like that. But I can see something like this starting to kind of aid in the fragmentation. And I don't know if that's necessarily a negative thing or a positive thing. I think it depends on what part of the country that you live in, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder what it starts to look like in a US context where historically there has been an emphasis on the individual and like on the nuclear kind of unit.
Well, it's very interesting. The early Californian pioneers in solar power is about how a community of people came together from very diverse political backgrounds to solve the technical problems of implementing solar panels. And so you've got preppers, survivalists, right-wing conspiracy theorists who want to get off the grid. You've got hippies, environmentalists, new homeowners, technologists, all these different groups of people who all had their own motivations for being interested in this technology, all collectively come together to say, okay, we've got this problem where like the grid, the meters don't actually run backwards. We've got all these sort of technical implementation problems that they could assemble a community around, even though they had such diverse political views and perspectives that wouldn't necessarily bring them together otherwise. There is a potential hiccup
that
I mentioned
go
earlier.
On. This is the woman who owns the sun, you said?
It is, yeah. Angie Lise Duran. Angelise Doran, in 2010, exploited a loop in another friend of the pod, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty.
Ah, okay.
Which claims that
Bring it
no
back.
state or organization can claim a celestial body. And so she thought, but I'm just an individual. And so she went to the
Interesting.
Spanish courts and said, I claim the sun. And they went, yeah, actually you can by law.
What?
Yeah, so Angelise Doran does technically own the sun. Now, she said she would start leasing the sun to solar energy users in 2010 at a cost of €1 a square meter. And she was going to do this by selling plots of it on eBay. eBay shortly after removed her listings because there's a ban on selling intangible goods on eBay. Angelise Doran is currently in court with eBay contesting the fact that the sun is an intangible good. So it remains to be seen.
Okay, well, I
What
have a question
stands-
though. If she owns the sun, is she liable for damages due to the sun?
You know what? That is exactly what legislators are speculating on. Is she liable for sunburn?
Yeah, truly. Listen, I think she owes more money than she's taxing.
Look, we could be doing this podcast in 50 years and it'll all be down to, our Lady Empress Angelise Doran. I mean, the question I suppose that I was trying to look at there is like, could people introduce artificial scarcity into distributed solar systems in order to support the market, and the thing that strikes me is this question of like, would people politicize their batteries? Like, would you say, I'm protesting a government decision and so I'm going to withhold my battery energy from the grid? Because I can do that. I have an app that I can just turn off export.
I can see that happening 100%, especially with the way society is going now. I can 100% see that. And I'm really curious to see how it evolves with maybe like, again, not our generation who has grown up completely jaded, but a younger generation of folks who maybe grow up in a more energy fluent world where it's part of their education and part of what they're aware of just growing up. And I think the issue of abundance versus scarcity when it comes to resources like energy and water are a lot more prevalent for younger generations these days. But I wonder if this helps to distribute people across land in different ways as well. So we're not kind of like the idea of mass urbanization and like density around these city centers that are originally kind of popped up because of proximity to resources. If that starts to also fragment or disperse in ways that we hadn't anticipated. Because like, here's the thing is if you have energy, you can at least start to build other infrastructures, right? To bring in food, you can find ways to bring in potentially water. You really just need the sun and some land. If you think about the trend towards remote work, there's an opportunity for, I'm not saying this is everyone, I'm saying this is a subsect, but it begs the question of the possibility of something like this, right?
Well, on that note, I'm also untethered because we are both in the wrong time zone.
We are both jet lagged, very jet lagged.
Lovely to talk to you.
Likewise, always.
Remember to like and subscribe.
Yes, people. Like and subscribe. All right, Tobias.
Toodles.
Have a good night. Toodles. Bye.